welcome everyone again. If you weren't here earlier, my name is Bill Fanning, a member of the Talk team, and we're really excited for today's discussion. I think it's really interesting to me as we start to think about hiring efficiency and the leveraging of the different technologies that we have at our disposal. As a side note, one of the things I've started to see in our industry is that, like in sales, where RevOps became really powerful for helping the sales teams because of all the tools you had available, there's almost a burgeoning role in my brain, which is a scary place to be, called tech ops or talent ops, where with all the tools and capabilities we have, really, how do we best optimize? And so I'm really excited for today's discussion. So hang on one sec. So just three quick updates. I've gone over all the notes from the meetings around the board discussions we had 2 weeks ago. I sent out an email yesterday with some high-level summarizations of what I heard, what I want to do, and what some of the next steps are going to be. You will see some more information from me next week, but I can't tell you how exciting it was to me to realize that there were that many people in our organization that want to continue to drive the growth of Talk. So that was an incredibly powerful discussions that we had, and I'm excited about it. The other thing I just wanted to mention, if you are in the Chicago area, or since we were talking baseball, by Wrigley Field, on October 29th, Amit is going to be in Chicago, and we're hosting a dinner. If you are in that area and that's like something you would like to attend, please reach out, let me know. I'd love to share with you where and what we're doing, but it could be a great experience and to continue this conversation in person. And then the only other thing I'd like to mention is if you have the ability to leave a review of a vendor or make a suggestion of a vendor that should be in our marketplace, that's awesome. And the goal of it is always to make our marketplace a rich source of information to help other TA leaders make decisions. So they can read your reviews, they can learn about technology, and it becomes a powerful wiki or data source around all of the versioning technology we have out there. So if you can do that, that would be great. So I'm going to introduce our two speakers, Amit and Jeremy from Informatica, and they're going to take over and I'm going to turn off my screen share, but really excited for today's discussion. And again, anything you need, just drop it in the chat or speak up. And the only final thing I'll say is if you can turn your camera on, please do. We love to see everyone's faces. It makes a great sense of community in the conversation. If you can, I certainly understand, no problem. But I always like to ask that. So thanks, everybody. And I'm going to turn it over to Amit.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen.
And there we go.
There we go. Oops. There we go. My name is Amit Bhatia. I'm the co-founder of Data People. And every month I have a conversation with a visionary talent leader. We're very fortunate to have many of them, as customers. And today I'm so excited to partner with Talk and to talk to Jeremy Bushaw, the Vice President of Global TA at Informatica. I mean, we were talking about baseball earlier, and I feel like baseball, talent acquisition is going through a transformative revolution like sabermetrics did back in the 90s and the 2000s, where we're starting to question all of our most fundamental assumptions about the way we hire. And we're starting to ask ourselves, how can we be working in a completely different way? And if that's the revolution that's happening, Jeremy is, Billy Bean. And so I'm so excited to have you with us, Jeremy. Thanks for taking the time.
Well, Amit, that's quite the compliment of Billy Bean, so I appreciate that. Thanks to be here and excited to kind of talk about, the conversation that we've been, going through for the past year or so.
Exactly. Jeremy, now I have to ask, you were a front desk receptionist and you have made it all the way in your career to vice president of talent acquisition for one of the world's largest companies. Like, how does somebody go about doing that?
I would say a lot of it's luck, drive, and motivation. I think it's always a funny story when I tell this to my team. It's like, I graduated college, had no clue what I wanted to do. And I think it was within the first month, the CHRO at the previous company I was at, as I was sitting at the front desk, was like, this job's not for you. You got to do something more, big, powerful, and exciting. So come along with me. So I went on a really exciting, it's almost been, I'll just say 15 plus years, exciting journey, exploring HR, figuring out where in HR, where in the business that, I had passion about, where I can make a big impact. And, I'll just say, luckily enough, I ended up leading a fantastic talent acquisition team over here at Informatica. And we've been on a really exciting journey, transformation from a company perspective, and just really excited about the future that we foresee coming from Informatica.
That's phenomenal. The reason I asked Jeremy to talk to us today, and I wanted to have this specific conversation, was when I'm looking around at the landscape of recruiting, and I talk to talent leaders every day, we are more stressed out and tightly there's no slack in the system. And our hiring managers, our business units think, oh my God, the labor market's getting easier. It must be so easy to hire. They're like, Jeremy, go get me hundreds of engineers. Where do you find them? And they don't have an appreciation for how little capacity there is in the system, especially with companies that start to scale. And so today's conversation is going to be hopefully very, very tactical about what are the things that we've figured out, what are things Jeremy's especially figured out at an organization like Informatica on what can unlock massive amounts of efficiency. But before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about how we even measure hiring efficiency. Folks, if I'm going to ask you in the audience, like, how do you measure hiring efficiency? How do you measure, is it recruiter capacity? In which case, I'm going to ask you how you measure recruiter capacity, because that itself is $1 million question. And if you're not comfortable shouting it out loud and going off mute, just write in on the chat and tell us, what are you looking today to measure how efficient your hiring is? And Bill told me this is going to be a very participative crowd, so don't let Bill down here.
I don't know if it's necessarily efficiency, but we do measure capacity.
Okay.
And maybe it's simplistic, but we basically went through all of our jobs and created and gave it a value. So we use almost like a work in progress, that we call it our WIP points. So it's pretty simplistic, but if you're recruiting for an architect, then you get 10 points. If you're recruiting for a customer service rep, you get 4. So it just sort of depends on the level of complexity, expectations around sourcing, those sorts of things. And then our goal is that we keep our team at right about 100 points. It doesn't always work out that way, but at least it gives us a snapshot to look at. But that's not necessarily hiring efficiency, just capacity.
I love that. I love the point-based approach, because it allows you to start to think about, the different types of roles differently. Now, when I look at the chat, and I can barely keep up with it, it's very much time to fill, cost to hire, time to fill. And of course, and one of my frustrations with recruiting is every single company I've worked with defines it slightly differently, where it starts where it says, so Jeremy, to you, how do you measure hiring efficiency at Informatica?
Yeah, I mean, I love seeing the chat kind of go through right now. I think, being a support arm of the organization from a TA perspective, time to fill is, quite honestly, what the business cares about. It's like they had someone leave, they have a new initiative, they need this, person in seat as soon as possible. As we are in the data integration space, it's kind of interesting, how I look at in measuring efficiency. When I first started here, there was a lot of push, a lot of shove from our leaders, our executives, is like, how are we going to improve time to fill? And as we started bringing more and more of the data from our ATS into our data warehouse and doing a lot of kind of visualization, as sure as everyone knows that, look, time to fill it's a metric to see how fast we can get people in revenue generating seats, how fast we can get people to be productive. But I tell now we've kind of changed the tune, changed the conversation here at Informatica. It's like, if you really want to look at time to fill, you're probably going to be pretty embarrassed by where the majority of the recruiting process sits within the business. And ultimately the business owns a lot of the accountability on that time to fill. So we've kind of changed the tune where we've done a lot of ramping up in 20 to 22, like a lot of other organizations where we were doing north of about 2,000 hires per year. We've gotten to more, I would say prudent hiring in the past year and a half. And so what we've really, by surveying a lot of the hiring managers, surveying candidates, what we've really noticed is there's been this shift for us around quality, but how quick does that quality align with the requirements? So we are a big proponent of looking at quality of hire. We take a swath or a cross section of people that we hired in previous years, look at their performance scores is kind of a initial cut that we do to evaluate. Look, are the people that are coming in the doors, are they being successful, and is their tenure continuing to be, here at Informatica after that? But then we took it kind of from a different angle from all of the surveys that we've kind of surveyed hiring managers when we close out jobs. It's like they really care about speed and efficiency. So it's understanding what was the time to first submittal, what was the time to first interview, and how do we, give repeatable expectations when we open up jobs, like as part of our intake session. How do we set appropriate expectations with a hiring manager? If we're hiring an architect, we're able to look at our historical data to say, well, you're not going to get that resume within 7 days because based on the historical data, an architect may take 2 weeks based on the market.
That's right.
So it's ultimately using a lot of the data and really making sure that I have enough coverage from a recruiting capacity to be able to meet some of these core, I would say, concerns that the hiring team had. So it's really giving, fair and expectations up front. Obviously, time to fill is something that we look at when, we have something 200 days old, we got to look at it, but it's not really something that from a organization that we value very much from a metric standpoint.
Jeremy, I really like that point, that subtlety, that time to fill is not the absolute, like one of the problems when we anchor to presenting to leadership teams is, leadership teams love seeing everything go up to the right. So you got, time to fill is now down to 60 days. Now they want to see it 59, 58. That's not always a good idea. It's about outliers and it's about making stability. One thing we notice in our data sets, because we are looking at hundreds of millions of jobs and outcomes, very often, especially what's happened in the last couple of years, is LinkedIn and Indeed have made it so easy to one-click apply to jobs. And so what happens in the first 2 weeks of your job posting, you get inundated with often one-click applies who haven't even read the job description. And the really thoughtful applications start to come in week 3, 4. So when you're super fixated on time to fill, your recruiters are often very motivated to start to go through candidates like day one, when you really, especially for, as you mentioned, the data architect roles, you want to almost hold back and start to look at the population of candidates once you've started to get 50, 100 applicants in, and you've been able to go that. So you kind of want to give yourself the room to not have to hyper optimize time to fill. Jeremy, do you measure recruiter capacity? And how do you measure recruiter capacity in that realm?
I don't really directly measure recruiter capacity. I think we've done a lot of kind of research. It really depends on kind of the roles. I kind of like the point system that someone brought up earlier. I would say a lot of it's just kind of understanding pipeline coverage of just open requisitions to really, determine if we need to add additional capacity. But I think everyone in the TA world, it's a great question of do we measure it? But I think from a TA perspective, budgets have remained relatively flat a lot of the time. So it's look, even if we're underwater from a capacity standpoint, sometimes the budget doesn't really afford to add additional headcount. So it's we got to figure out how we, I would say, cross-enable other team members. Obviously we have peaks and valleys from a sales hiring or an engineering standpoint. So we've done a lot of cross-training of recruiters. So I could take someone that's lower on the engineering side and help them support some more pre-sales roles.
And one of the understated things that I think you've really figured out, Jeremy, is hiring ultimately is this team sport. And so capacity can sometimes depend on how much of the SLA does the recruiting team fulfill versus the hiring managers fulfill. Can the hiring managers take more ownership of writing a job? Can they take more ownership of running some of the early conversations? Are they so much of a recruiter's time gets sucked into the internal bureaucracy of an organization instead of managing candidates and that's what, and so really being vigilant about that. I think Rachel asked a really thoughtful, or I made a really thoughtful point on the chat about like, time to fill is not about an absolute time to fill, it's about the components of the time to fill. So we've seen some of our customers start to think about time to fill as time to publish, then followed by time to first 10 interviews at the phone screen stage, time to offer, and then time to hire. And so you really have to kind of break down this monolith of time to fill to understand and so much of the time in some of the larger organizations of time to fill goes in internal approvals, drafting the job, and all of that stuff. And that's where I felt like you've really unlocked. So I wanted to ask, and I want to bring this up to sort of the next phase. Hiring inefficiency has these 4 big contributors in my mind. The first is all of our tools have gotten so complicated that I think sometimes it takes like a rocket scientist to just figure out how to work Workday sometimes. Or any of the systems, there's hiring manager misalignment. How do you drive that? There's analytics, there's compliance standards. Jeremy, what is your stack? What is the talent stack at Informatica look like?
Yeah, so I think we've done a lot of work, Amit, over the 7-8 years of really, I would say, consolidation of the technology stack. Where I've noticed when I first started, we had a lot of different tools that the recruiters had available in the toolbox. But then when you kind of pulled back utilization, how well they were adopting these new tools and what was the performance that they got out of these particular tools, it was very embarrassing. It was almost like we were just wasting money on all these various different tools. So we've really streamlined. I think for me, it's very important about looking at tools that fit into the workflow that recruiters work within. Obviously, we're big around data analytics within the TA space. So I try to drive every time I have, I'm looking at additional tools. How does this sit on top of the ATS? How do the recruiters work within the workflow with this tool? So to answer your question directly, Amit, we have an ATS, which is Great People. We have some additional sourcing tools, LinkedIn, Naukri, and Seekout. And then ultimately within our ATS, we have CRM, and we do the onboarding within Workday. So Workday is our core HCM. So pretty slim down tech stack. We are always looking at adding additional tools in there. And I would say the tool I didn't mention, and that was Data People. About 1.5 years ago, we partnered with Data People. So pretty
and pushed us to integrate it so closely with your workflow. And I love it because that's the only way technology can really work for you is if it has to be enforced in your process. And I love how you built that.
And I think some of the things, Amit, just to kind of add on to that is like, we came off of 2022 at this like all-time record hiring. Like we were exhausted. The recruiters were just tired. And when we came into 23, I was really tasking my team with, let's identify these sore spots within the workflow to make this easier. So when the next time we do ramp up, we're not pulling out hair, we're not working, tons of hours to slug through the hires that we had to get through. And so it kind of really, like, every time I think I talk with my team, it's like, what's the sore spot now? How do we make improvements?
That's right.
Can we integrate with something? Where are the challenges? And that's just been like the evolution, I'd say, the past 1.5 years that we've tried to drive tools to drive efficiency of the recruiters so that we could run a little bit more leaner from a TA perspective.
Yeah. And I say this as a vendor to very large organizations. The best customers are the most demanding. They're the most demanding. Like you should not be light on your vendors because the tooling is there to support a best practice. And I think sometimes where I've seen customers make mistake, even when adopting us, is they haven't identified what the best practice is. And so they're just like, okay, this is like a nice feature, but a nice feature doesn't unlock efficiency for you at scale. What we've got to decide is your best practice hiring managers, hiring manager first recruiting process? That's the best practice. Is your best practice an enforced employer value proposition? If you're looking at a CRM, is your best practice that you're going after a proactive instead of a reactive recruiting process? And that may not be the design pattern you want to implement. But being really clear about the design patterns is something that I've always admired about the way you've run your team, because you make very intentional choices, and then everything falls around that, and then you push every partner you work with really hard to conform to those intentional choices. And I don't think enough companies do that, and that's why you end up with this bloat and inefficiency. So I want to then pull in that the idea that I've been really impressed with you. I think the design pattern you've chosen has been standardization. At your scale, you've said no efficiency can happen until we truly standardize, and you've taken it to the extreme level with an incredible job architecture. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. But at what point in this journey did you realize standardization? Because I'll be honest, when we're coming out of 2022, most companies, especially in tech, were the opposite of standardization. It was almost like every individual recruiter or team could go get their own tool, their own process, their own systems. Every geography could do it differently. At what point did you say, no, we got to do that? It has to be standardized. It has to be like Six Sigma.
Yeah, I think it was through the journey that I've been on. Every year, it's kind of been that standardization of trying to figure out, like, how do we make this easier, and how do we make it so it's consistent across the board. Amit, for those folks that don't know Informatica, we are just celebrating our 30th year anniversary.
Wow.
But in the 8 years that I've been here, we started as a 100% private on-prem data management software organization. We've transitioned to subscription. Now we're 100% in the cloud. And what I really struggled with is, and then we went public 2 years ago, was just the inconsistency of messaging, employer value prop, as well as just job architecture, skills taxonomy, all of those components that take up time, that are so important. And really, it's like, how do we make this easier? Like, I was sick of seeing old job descriptions that had, when we were on the NASDAQ, we were listed on 2021 on the stock exchange. So it's like, I can't keep getting slapped from marketing and branding about inconsistency within the job posts. So that was, for me, it was like the aha moment, is like, no one wants to take a time to write a job description. No one wants to really take the time to align it to the current, or the messaging that we currently were using. And it's like, everyone just wants to get the job posted, and ultimately, where are my candidates? When am I going to interview people? And it just felt like we were in this constant battle. So standardization, just really with the evolution of where we are going from an organization standpoint, some of the things from, how do we align our strong architecture that we've actually taken time to develop, and ultimately put it into play with our hiring managers, with finance, with our comp team, as well as the market.
I think that's where I bring it back to the Billy Bean and the baseball analogy we were talking about before, because I think until 2022, everyone was trying to think about recruiting as a candidate problem. We need another GRB. We need somebody who fits a certain mold. And what changed, and the revolution that's happened, is we're realizing, in some senses, the candidate problem, and maybe part of this is the market, but the candidate problem is a solved problem. And once you get to a certain scale, once you get to your scale, recruiting is not a candidate problem. It's a process problem. It is like, how do we build the same consistent habits so that then when we make interventions, we know we're not making interventions because somebody had like a feeling about something. We're making interventions because we can have consistent data, and you can't have consistent data until you have a standardization level. So I think that's why I call you Billy Bean. It's just you've seen this before everybody else, but I want to open it up to the audience again. We've got a lot of different ways inefficiency can come about in your org, and every one of our recruiting organizations is inefficient. So there is no shame. There is no shame. We're here to share our collective traumas. But 4 choices. Is it the complexity of your tooling? Because boy, is some enterprise software hard to use. Is it hiring managers driving you bananas? Because they do. Is it compliance? Because pay transparency and every other regulation just keeps coming up in different geographies. Or is it something else? Is it just a lack of great candidates? Is it the distributed world that we live in? Which one of these 4 would you describe as your biggest source of hiring inefficiencies? Unmute yourselves and shout it out, or write it on the chat. I'm kind of curious.
My biggest pain point is the time that it takes to screen candidates.
Because you're just getting, are you hiring remote? It's like all these hundreds of unqualified applicants like coming in.
Well, there's definitely time in reviewing resumes, but for truly qualified candidates in trying to get to them for a live conversation in a timely manner is my biggest bottleneck.
You know, I feel like we're in such a weird recruiting environment. Crystal's having this problem. Like, how do we get to the qualified candidate, like the needle in the haystacks? And Paula saying the same thing on the chat, but we're also hearing some folks saying we're just not getting enough applicants. And those problems can happen at the same companies. It's kind of mind-boggling. And you're right, Crystal. It is hard. It is hard. And I'd love to talk to you. Simple things, having a very clear employer value proposition, having a very clear standardized job architecture. A lot of the companies we talk to are starting to think about it in those ways because it can be such an unlock in then driving the screening and driving the qualified, driving signal to noise ratio. In my mind, the rule of thumb is your inbound sources, your careers page, LinkedIn, are your best sources getting you at least 15%, 10 to 15% of applicants applying are making it through phone screen. Sometimes I look at companies' data and it's like 1%. And you're like, that's nuts. If you got to go through 100 resumes to find one person to phone screen, then we got to thrash the system and start over. And that's the challenge that we have to deal with. So we've heard a few people. So we've got a few people said lengthy interview process. I'm going to ask you about lengthy interview process. Is it lengthy because your hiring managers demand a lot of interviews? Is it lengthy because they take too long to conduct the interviews? And I'm going to ask you, Jeremy. Jeremy, you've had hiring managers sometimes be difficult. How do you crack the whip? How do you they don't report to TA, but they drive TA results in some senses. So how do you drive that better?
Yeah, I mean, the challenges that I'm seeing come through the chat, I think it's all really super relevant. It is happening here at Informatica. I mean, couple big things is huge surge in candidates that we're seeing currently right now. Lengthy interview process, managers not being responsive. A lot of the things I would say where I've been, I keep falling back on this notion, and I would encourage people to kind of explore their, data journey with the ATS and, just metrics of looking at funnel activity. A lot of it is it's monitoring and trying to put automation within the tools to drive the activities or the outcomes that we're looking for. We see a lot of the time resumes that have been screened by recruiters. We're sitting, years ago, they were sitting 5 to 7 days with a hiring manager. So we implemented a lot of automation and reminders within our ATS to really kind of minimize that time delay, at least on a submittal standpoint. From a lengthy interview process, we've incorporated some new tooling. We use a technical video assessment for some of our technical hiring. Which we've also incorporated into other use cases from a sales, pre-sales, CSM standpoint. And we really noticed that managers were asking the same questions, interview after interview after interview. So typically we were trying to drive reduction of interview rounds by using a video assessment up front or using it throughout the interview process. We've also, kind of peeled back the onion. Is like, why do you need 7 people to make a decision on one person, especially on the lower level jobs? So we've tried to provide them with insights around candidates' skills, more thorough recruiter screens so that they feel comfortable when they get to, I would say, round 4 of an interview process. They feel more comfortable making hiring decisions. But then we also kind of fold in the quality of hire to kind of give a perspective of which employers that we've hired from previously have actually, accounted for high quality performance within their particular roles, which has helped a lot. So I think by reducing some of the noise around, how long it sits with managers, trying to better understand, like, what are we trying to achieve from a interview rubric on the 7th round of interview? Can we consolidate that into 3 or 4 rounds is really where we've been trying to focus to help get managers more efficient.
Love that. Now, I saw a number of questions on the chat are about hiring managers. And They are both our best friends, but sometimes our worst enemies in talent acquisition. And I wanted to make 2 points about how do we enable them better. The first is the intake meeting is critical. It's where everything begins. And we found 2 types of sort of success with companies. The first is I think the highest level of success we find is where companies get the hiring managers to own the job description. That takes a little bit of work. You need to template it out. You need to kind of build the right tooling. But one of the biggest problems when we set up this relationship with hiring managers at the intake meeting is talent acquisition has done ourselves a disservice by setting ourselves up as a service partner and not a genuine partner to hiring managers. So we show up and they treat us a little bit like we're assistants. They're like, oh, go write the job, now go run the rec, and then show me the great candidates once they're ready. And it doesn't work that way. We all know it doesn't work that way. We've got to get them to take ownership of the steps. And that very first ownership starts with you writing a really thoughtful job ad, not a job description, not a confusing laundry list of your requirements or where you went to college 40 years ago, but a job ad that is market calibrated. And the more our recruiters can force that in the intake meeting, the more effective it is. The second thing that I found, so we built a report on our platform, and you can build your own version of it. It's very easy, is we call it a bottleneck report, a rec bottleneck report. Too often you're running a rec, and then halfway through you're doing all the work. Recruiters are doing all sorts of work, and you find the hiring managers, candidates been sitting in 20 days in the decision stage, 40 days in the decision stage, and the hiring managers haven't moved on them. With some of our customers, they're like, no, after 2 days, the rec gets frozen. I feel like that's a little extreme. But we've got to get them into the habit of, we're partners. We are not here to just be assistants to you. And we're here to acquire talent together, and that takes a partnership and an effort. So it is the strategy and alignment meeting. I love those ideas. So let's talk a little bit, Jeremy, about the journey you had. So you talked about this. You had a finance and talent misalignment, another set of alignment that needs to happen at companies, right? Especially in a world with pay transparency. You're putting the ads on your job. I'm sure every one of you have had this experience where you put an ad on the job and then an existing employee's been like, wait a minute, this doesn't match my range. And then you have all sorts of other problems. And then you had to go from a job description to a job ad. Again, I see too many companies putting out whatever job profiles in Workday gets published into the internet. And that's not going to do you any favors. And then you're going to end up with Crystal's problem, which is how do you get quality out of that? How do you sift through that? And then the evolution of corporate branding, and you talked about this. Your EVP evolved, and so we need to flow that EVP through everything. And you did this so beautifully, and you how long did this addressing these challenges take, and in which order did you go?
Yeah, I mean, all 3 of these were big challenges that we were having as the organization was growing. I think for me, the biggest pain point was the third one to at least start out with, was the messaging was changing. We were seeing crazy job descriptions come through. Hiring managers really weren't taking the time to align them. My recruiters weren't taking the time to update the messaging. Just really created a big headache for me. So one of the big things I would say, to just kind of start out with your point there, was one of the things when we were looking at a job description vendor is here at Informatica, our hiring managers start the requisition process for us within our ATS. There's so much time that I believe that recruiters and hiring managers go back and forth of trying to figure out what's the cost center, what's the job code, what's the job description, all this stuff that goes typically back and forth via email. And I was like, look, I'm tired of wasting my recruiting capacity chasing around emails to get these things inputted. So partnering with data people is very valuable, really important for me to find a vendor that could ultimately sit within the hands of the hiring manager, because that's where we drove accountability. So great things was, standardized messaging and branding from a template standpoint, which we were able to solve. Ultimately, our hiring managers are able to go in, select a template. It has current messaging. We're able to update on the fly. We're able to track and make sure the recruiters are adhering to the templates, which has been super valuable. I would say the next thing for us was job descriptions versus job adverts. We're Workday HCM. Our comp team has, I would say, very compliance-focused job descriptions. And it was always troubling for me as like, these aren't what we can use. So ultimately we were looking for a solution that could ultimately build out a repository of the content, but also remain, some of the consistency that we would require from a years of experience onto our job description. So we were able to lock certain fields, because what we were noticing a lot of the times is hiring managers had a job description stored on their laptop. Oh, Billy left. I need to find another Billy. And Billy was a principal software engineer. Billy had 15 years of experience. And so what I was noticing when we didn't have this consistency in our job advertisements was we get through a 30, 45-day process, hiring managers turn around and say, our compensation ranges don't align with the market. Well, it's like the job description we're using for Billy has 14 years of experience. And when we're pricing out what a current principal engineer is, it should have 8 years of experience. So obviously major misalignment there. And then really gets back to, I would say the finance and talent side of it is we were hard to drive consistency of years of experience, scope of roles, because managers had a free-for-all. They were able to use whatever job description was allowed. So that's really taken a lot of, I would say, time and effort off the plates of our recruiters, where we give them the tooling, we help, job description, write job descriptions, we give them templates, we give them the guidance, and managers are actually more encouraged by this workflow versus having to wait for a recruiter to kind of like pick the ticket number at the DMV and wait for them to, action their requisition. So more of the self-service approach was really something that I would say a lot of the standardization helped us enable our hiring managers to be able to take on this. I'd just say
that point is so important. I think sometimes when I think about it, intellectually, we are like, our hiring managers would never go for this. Our hiring managers, and you'll be surprised, hiring managers actually, they want to get going. They, because they're feeling that pain of not having that engineer, not having that account executive, not having that person on their team. They want to get going, but they don't know how. And the more nice part about things like Workday HCM is it's starting to get a lot of our organizations more comfortable with self-serve and self-reliance and just getting going. So I love that idea. So now, this is one of my favorite parts of our conversation. I want to open it up to say, what have you unlocked? Is there a hack, a trick, something in the community that you've figured out that like really unlocks outcomes for you or efficiency for you? I'm kind of curious. I'm gonna pause and let somebody chime in.
I'll just throw this out there. We've, at least on my team, I run a small team of recruiters for our mailing business at ADM, and we're huge. We're 42,000 people across the globe. But I've changed the culture on my team. It's like we are partners with hiring managers. You have to understand that we are professionals in what we do. You are professionals in what you do. This job description or job ad, we need to get better at that. You own it. You work it every day. You're the one that knows the ins and outs. But you have to understand that SLAs that are kind of in place, we need that feedback, and we need it when you agreed to it. So those types of things, our recruiters come out and discuss that in the strategy meeting, and we make no bones about it. If you want to go 4, 5, 6 days sitting on applications or recruiters or candidates, we'll just pause your rec. It's like, it's just what happens, So wow. You don't, if you're not working, we're not working. We've got other things to work on, and we've got people who are working with us to do that and to be successful. So, all right, we'll just hit the pause button and let us know when you're ready to get back to work. I mean, it just has to happen that way.
I love that. Hit the pause button. It frightens me sometimes that like we can do that, but it is power to you. That is the way to do it. Thank you for sharing. Anybody else figured out anything downstream? Anything that sort of really unlocks efficiency for you? The one thing that, I'm going to give you one counterintuitive tip that's really unlocked efficiency for a few companies. It's when you hire in the intake meeting, when the hiring manager comes in with a role, if you can get them, make the role slightly less qualified than they make it. So if they're asking you for like a senior principal engineer, try to bring it down to like a senior engineer. If they're asking you for a senior, And you'll be surprised, there's something counterintuitive happening in the market. We've seen this in our research that when you slightly overqualify a role, you get counterintuitively 30 to 40% fewer qualified applicants, and you get fewer women and underrepresented candidates apply. And one of the biggest unlocks that happens is if you almost like, it's a little bit like, I don't know, bidding theory, right? If you like, you list your house, you list your house with like a price that's slightly below and then you get bid up over time. It's almost the same thing with the job. You list the job a little bit lower and you'll find it's easier to bid up and get really highly qualified candidates, maybe even more senior than you expected. But if you start trying to get a very senior candidate, it actually sometimes gets you stuck in this role where you're like, I can't seem to find enough. And it's the nature of the search algorithms. It's the nature of what's happening in the market right now. So Jeremy, I want to ask you now the question that's on everyone's mind, I'm sure. What is your journey with AI? And where are you on that? Where are you on the spectrum of using AI to unlock efficiency for your organization?
It's a great question. I would say every day I'm trying to figure out kind of where would I assess the organization of maturity related to using AI. What I think is great when I look across the broader spectrum, every recruiting tool that we touch now has a claim to AI. Everyone's, embedding it into their applications. There are a lot of different use cases that we've been looking at internally here at Informatica of how do we use AI? How do we make sure it's secure, it's safe for us to use? So some of the areas that we are exploring is, helping write brand new job advertisements, which is always a challenging thing to do. It's like, okay, what's the best source? We're going to go to Google and spend hours upon hours looking for job descriptions. Other use cases that I've seen really take off is we've built a kind of white label GPT internally. So creating Boolean strings for some of the sourcing activities have been super beneficial. But the one that most excites me is how do we take a job description? How do we take a candidate resume plus recruiter notes to be able to make submissions, really comprehensive write-ups that align to job descriptions for our hiring managers. We probably spend 15, 20, 25 minutes doing write-ups after interview screens. So it's almost, you get one screen per hour, depending on, how well your managers like submission notes. So we've been really trying to explore how do we fit that type of use case into our workflow. But again, it's trying to tackle, I think from an AI standpoint, where's the big time suck for each of our recruiters? Like, where are they spending time? And are we giving them, some recruiters might have different workflows, how they do their work. So it's really unlocking AI where we can meet help the recruiters be successful in their role.
That makes a ton of sense. And it's confusing. We're in this weird world where everyone is promising this amazingness with AI. It feels like back in 2008 when like the mobile app was going to change us. And it did. It just changed us in ways we didn't expect. Like it wasn't the Budweiser app that really made it. It was like, Zillow and all of these things where you don't think of it as a mobile app. You just think of it as an amazing thing that you need. And I think that's what's happening with AI. And I love the way you're thinking about the summarization of the interview notes and the JD and putting them all together, because that's what some of the generative capabilities do so well. So I wanted to briefly summarize, like what is the hiring efficiency roadmap? And the way we're seeing this play out across, big companies and smaller. So it starts with standardization. As you heard about that with Jeremy, like very hard to drive efficiency without a base of standardization, and ideally the standardization going beyond talent acquisition to the hiring managers, because we know that no matter how efficient we make our teams, we are in some senses limited by the organizational culture around us. And then that brings us to the idea of collaboration, changing the service model from a SLA-driven service model to a partnership-driven service model and a collaborative service model where they take ownership for parts of it and we take ownership for parts of it and we work together in a really effective way. And then finally, oops, I'm going wrong way. It's compliance and outcome performance. Like today, I was talking to a customer who's been now sort of thinking about this for a few years, and now we're starting to ask the question, can each recruiter start to become data-driven? Can they start to, and it's kind of, our expectations of talent acquisition have been mind-boggling, right? We want them to be great writers. We want them to be relationship managers, salespeople. We want them to be, and now we're expecting them to also be data scientists. And with very difficult tooling and with very kind of, without a ton of training or without a ton of time for training. But when we have some of these baselines, Jeremy, I think you're running one of the most data-driven teams I've ever seen. And I think the reason you're able to get there is because you've solved problem A and problem B first. Like you've done the standardization journey, you've done the collaboration journey. I want to ask you, when you think about data-driven as a means of unlocking efficiency, do you enable or train your talent acquisition professionals to become data-driven? Like, how do you build that culture?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's been an evolution. I think one of the things, it kind of gets back to this kind of whole chart here, Amit, is from a consistency standpoint. I'm going to call it intake, but now I got to use the comment in the chat to read it. But it's really like laying the groundwork and foundation for intake calls. So every time a rec gets open, we have this kind of streamlined checklist that we ultimately provide to the recruiters. And some of those things are market intelligence, but also looking at, we have dashboards built specifically for intake calls to be able to define those key milestones, which we think are important from a time expectations, as well as expectation setting for a particular search. And typically we train and enable these recruiters on how to use the tooling to look for market intelligence that we expect them to show up to this intake call with, how to use the dashboards and why this is important. And it's like, I'm sure my team is sick of hearing me saying like, you didn't reference the dashboard, but we kind of have this like checks and balances. We create consistency of how our managers expect us to show up from a TA perspective. And so sometimes like we do hiring manager feedback surveys after we close out recs. I didn't get any market intelligence from this particular recruiter. So it's almost like this quarterly closed loop process that I have with my team. It's like, we're not here to get anyone in trouble, but when we look at your effectiveness score, you're struggling on showing up with talent intelligence. And this is important to your hiring managers so you can articulate those expectations. So it's kind of, I would say, we've given them the tooling, we've provide, consistent enablement and training around the expectations of what it means to be a talent partner here at Informatica.
I love it. I love the way you're sort of bringing them along this journey and ultimately making them, that's building their careers. I mean, I just come back to the way your career has been built from front office all the way to the VP of TA, and you're creating chances for them to do that, a culture for them to do that, which is incredible. Well, with the last couple of minutes, I just wanted to give you a very short introduction to what Data People is and how our customers use us. We solve 4 key issues in enterprises, and we work out of the box with whatever ATS and whatever systems you use. The first is, how do we drive TA productivity by helping you write really great, compelling job ads faster? We improve the hiring manager experience, like Jeremy alluded to, by making better intake meetings, by bringing market data into the intake meeting and getting them to be more effective. We improve D&I outcomes. Most of our large companies get to see more women, more underrepresented candidates applying and getting hired. And finally, making sure all of this compliance is automatic. It's checked for you, whether it's pay transparency, OFCCP, ADA, EVP compliance, whatever you're struggling with, you don't have time for that. We want to make sure we can automate that for you. And we do it with some incredible, thoughtful AI as well as other tooling. So you can, whether you're writing a job using a single repository or using what we call our generative AI capability First Draft to automatically generate a great job description from scratch. Our goal is to make it really quick, make it really efficient for your teams to work together. They use us in 80 countries around the world with hundreds of customers. I'd love to show you what it's about. And if you're interested, I'd just love to give you an analysis of your open jobs and show you where opportunities are. But you've been an incredible audience. I have to say, I've enjoyed this immensely. I've enjoyed the sharing of the lessons once I figured out how to stop share. And I want to thank Jeremy. Jeremy, you've been an incredible person to have this conversation with.
Amit, thanks for having me, and Norm and Bill, thanks for the invite as well. This has been great.
No, absolutely. I'm glad both of you could come. I think it's been a phenomenal discussion. I loved all the engagement. It's definitely something that it's really interesting to me. I from being on both sides of the hiring manager and that recruiting lead trying to deal with the hiring manager, it always reminded me of that gentleman who's on masterclass from the FBI or CIA that teaches people how to negotiate. That's what I think you need sometimes to work with a hiring manager. It's that masterclass of negotiation. So, so I'm glad that topic was brought up and we put some thoughts into it. It was awesome. And we have a couple minutes left. If anyone has any final questions or concerns that they wanted to bring up, and love to talk about it. And again, just selfishly, I'm going to put out there if anyone's in the Chicago area and would love to come for a dinner. We're going to have a great conversation. We can expand on some of the topics we've discussed today, and love to. It's going to be on October 29th, and we're going to be right inside the loop. So if it's of interest, please just reach out and let me know. Awesome, guys. Well, thank you very, very much. I really appreciate everyone's time, participation, and the questions that you put in here. Thanks for attending, and we will be sharing this with everybody shortly. So feel free to share it with anyone on your team, and we'll talk soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Have a
Bye-bye.
great rest of your day. Bye.